G'day, brothers and sisters. This is the other Paul, and this is also my buddy Michael Potamopotos. Is that where the emphasis is?
Right, yeah, just like
Got it
Christoph.
right. Perfect. This is my buddy Mike. How are you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, thanks. How about you?
I am doing very well. It is a very nice Australian evening right now where I am. I am ready to go. This is going to be flipping really, really cool. For anyone who's just jumped in right now and has not managed to read the title just yet, this is going to be an absolute historical red pill. Michael here is going to be demonstrating from the evidence that Greek at the time of Christ was in fact the lingua franca of Judea, and thus that Jesus in his public ministry very likely spoke Greek. And thus the Gospels that we have today are not merely translations of the words of Jesus from Aramaic, but really are the words of Jesus himself. So,
Right.
Mike, let's jump right into it. I cannot wait. Give us an intro about yourself. Give us your background, your denomination, whatnot, all that
Right.
stuff.
Yeah, so my name is Michael Potamopotos. It's the name I use as a theologian online, at least, because the Danish name is even less pronounceable. So I'm 26 years old. I live on a small farm I run with my family. By job, I'm a theologian. I wrote my master's thesis on the Septuagint, which included a couple of chapters discussing the lingual background and context of Israel in the time of Christ. So it's a topic that I've been dealing somewhat with.
Very excellent, very excellent. And if you want, you can, because Michael here right now has just launched his YouTube channel, Truth Unto Godliness. I forgot to get the link for that. I'll probably get that in a minute or so once you start talking again. But he's just launched this channel right now, a very nice continental Lutheran themed channel, and he's just begun videos. He's just launched his first video, the first in a series on justification, including in responses to Roman conceptions of justification, responding to that, attempting to refute it. Going to be excellent stuff. And for tonight, as he mentioned, as Michael himself mentioned, this is a big area of study for him. Particularly, your main work, I believe, was on the Septuagint itself, and then this was like a major part of it in order to make a case.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So I think I forgot to mention that. As you said earlier, I'm also a confessional Lutheran. I'm part of the small, sadly, confessional Lutheran Synod in Denmark. So it's a nice confessional church body, but not the largest, as many of you viewers likely are aware. Western Europe especially is dominated by very large liberal state churches. So, but we are a couple of faithful fighters trying to stand up for God's revealed truth. And yeah, that's though quite tangential to the topic of tonight. I do think that a very easy answer to why do I think Christ spoke Greek would just be because the Bible told me so. So it might be a very, very short live stream we're doing here tonight, because when I take out the original apocryphs of the New Testament writings, I read the very documents which were written by Luke, Matthew, John, Mark, and in them we read the words, the dialogues, and the sayings of our Lord in Greek. The contention here, of course, is that didn't he speak Aramaic? That was the native language of the indigenous Jewish population of Israel at the time of Christ. So that's what we're going to discuss here during this live stream. Hebrew having died out somewhere in the time after the exile and return from Babylon, and up till around the time of Christ, where the Hebrew language receded into a more liturgical language of culture and the elites. But I actually want to read a small passage from the book of First Maccabees, a part of the Deuterocanon. The first chapter, it's actually the prologue to the whole book, and it states in verse 1, "And it happened after that Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, who came out of the land of Greece, had smitten Darius, king of the Persians and Medes, that had reigned in his stead, the first over Greece, and made many wars, and won many strongholds, and slew the kings of the earth, and went through to the ends of the earth, and took spoils of many nations, insomuch that the earth was quiet before him. And whereupon he was exalted, and his heart was lifted up, and he gathered a mighty strong host, and ruled over countries and nations and kings, who became tributaries unto him. I think this passage provides a nice context to an often somewhat overlooked epoch of Jewish history. Because when we finish reading the small prophets, we often skip from, oh, glorious return from the exile, Jewish rule in Jerusalem has been restored. We read in Ezra and Nehemiah that the temple is rebuilt and it's going pretty good. And then we arrive on the scene in Matthew chapter 1, and the Romans are ruling. I mean, what happened in that middle period? And that's one of the reasons why I think it's a good thing to read the Deuterocanon and to be familiar with the content. This is not a question of canonicity, but just as like the historical value of the documents alone, it provides quite an important insight into the context. And that is very important, because as we read here, prior to the arrival of the Greeks, Israel had been Greek for hundreds of years, around 250 years. In the book of Second Maccabees, we read in the 4th chapter, and we'll discuss the Maccabean revolts somewhat more later. But in the book of Second Maccabees, the 4th chapter, we read, "Now such was the height of Hellenism, an increase of heathenish manners, through the exceeding profaneness of Jason, that ungodly wretch, and no high priest." This passage is also quite important in that it describes or critiques, to put it mildly, the high priest Jason of Jerusalem. First of all, that's a very Greek name, not a Jewish name at all. It describes how the height of Hellenism, Hellenismu, was reached already hundreds of years, a long time before Christ was even born. Jewish high priests were so thoroughly Hellenized that they even took on Greek names. The professor of New Testament studies, Timothy Law, he says that we can't really exaggerate how massive the influx of Greek language and culture was in this long period of Greek dominance. He says that there has never been such a widespread adaptation of culture in history. If the closest analogy is the spread of the Arabic language and Islamic culture in the wake of Muhammad's victories, even this wasn't as widespread or rapid as the Hellenization of the world from Greece to India between the 4th and the 1st century before Christ.
Far out.
Yeah, and I mean, this is not some like far-flung weirdo. This is like the mainstream scholarly opinion. And what we mustn't forget either is that if we have the coastline of the Mediterranean, then on south of Israel we would have Ptolemaic Egypt, a Greek dynasty ruling over a thoroughly Hellenized Egypt with great some of the largest cities in the world, like Alexandria, a Greek-speaking city. That was to the south of Israel. To the north of Israel, then we would have the Seleucid Empire, another Greek empire, one of the largest cities in the world, Antiochia. So even in the great wars between these successor kingdoms to Alexandria's empire, we see that it isn't a question of whether there were Greek influence or Greek rule over Israel. It's only a question of which Greek superpower would rule over Israel. And this development continues. One of the early authors, a Greek rhetorician, I think it's called. I hope the language barrier isn't.
Yeah, rhetorician. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. He died. He died in 338 before Christ, and he wrote about Hellenism already taking place in his own day. He says, "And so far has our city Athens distanced the rest of mankind in thought and speech, that her pupils have become the teachers of the rest of the world, and she has brought it about that the name Hellenes, Hellenes, that just means Greek, like a Greek person, suggests no longer a race, but an intelligence, and the title Hellenes is applied rather to those who share our culture than to those who share a common blood." And this is important because and this is like much earlier than the time period we are discussing, but already back then there was a concept spreading throughout the Mediterranean basin that Greek was no longer a matter of ethnicity. It was a matter of culture, of language, of habits, and that just and to have such an groundbreaking concept just really presupposes that this development is quite a big, commonly observed phenomena going on. So I mentioned the Maccabean revolt earlier, and this is a very interesting and famous story. And
so before you continue, just in case it wasn't clear already, people, we're neck deep into the case right now.
You're right, of course. So when discussing the Maccabean revolt, because sometimes the Maccabean revolt is often framed as you have a group of very pious, very nationalistically minded Jews fighting to overthrow Greek rule, Greek dominance, heathen culture, pagan worship. And that's all true. That's all true. And we read about Judas Maccabeus' fight for freedom for the Jewish nation. But what is very important here, and what I think really underscores the creeping dominance of Greek already in the 2nd century before Christ, is that the Maccabeans themselves, the Maccabean revolt, was actually quite Greek in nature. One of the you might say the foreign ambassador of Judas Maccabeus was a Greek Jew called Eupolemos. He was also an historian. He wrote a great history work about the Jewish wars and the Jewish kings, which he published in Greek, of course. And here, obviously, Eupolemos means like a strong fighter, good fighter in Greek. It's a Greek name, not a Jewish name. And he was sent by Judas Maccabeus to the Roman Senate to represent the Jewish nation. And this is important because I think it helps to show that when we are discussing the influence of Greek culture and language, then even in the most conservative and traditionally minded parts of Jewish society, like the Maccabean revolt, who stood for all things Jewish, even there you had a high degree of Hellenism, because they didn't see it as something opposed to their Jewish faith, Jewish nation, because they were fighting against heathen culture, heathen worship, and pagan religion, not against Greek language or Greek influence. That was just taken for granted. That was something part and parcel of the whole society back then. And we see this in the development of the Deuterocanon as well. First of all, 2nd Maccabees is written in Greek. It wasn't a translation of an Aramaic original or anything. So parts of scripture here are actually being written and composed in Greek rather than Aramaic or Hebrew. Same with the book of First Esdras, which was a very common part of the Septuagintal canon used by Jews and in the centuries up to Christ and used by the church fathers. It's also a work composed in Greek. Likewise, the additions to the book of Esther. Some of you or viewers might be familiar that the book of Esther in the Roman canon and in the Eastern Orthodox canon is quite a bit larger than the Protestant edition of Esther. And these editions are composed in Greek and not in Aramaic or Hebrew. So we actually see the influence and dominance of Greek language being so common that even scripture now is being composed in Greek. And by scripture here, I mean, this is not a discussion of the canon. So I use the term in a very broad, loose sense, not as canonical scripture, but as
Not discussing it here. We know the Romanists and the Easterners are wrong, but we're not discussing it here.
Right. Yeah, we can take that discussion another time. So I think this is like the broad context. Now we have been looking from the time of the advent of Alexander the Great, the conqueror, around. Now we are at maybe 100 years prior to the birth of our Lord, and we see that not only do we have in literature and culture a strong Greek influence, we actually also see that quite a bit of colonization took place in Israel itself. Many new cities were founded. In the New Testament, we read about the Decapolis, the 10, that means 10 cities in Greece. It was a loose confederacy of city-states collected together, all of which were heavily Hellenized, some of which were fully fledged Greek towns. We can also just hear it on the names. It was cities like Caesarea, Pella, Dion, Ptolemais, Philadelphia, Scythopolis, Philatria, and so on. And some of these cities, quite interestingly, used to be the Jewish cities. So, for example, Ptolemais was the Jewish city formerly known as Akko, and Philadelphia was formerly known as Rabat Ammon. So we see that there is such a heavy influx of Greek settlers, of Greek culture, that renaming and rebranding the cities is part of the urban development prior to Christ. This is not to say, I think this must be noted, it wasn't like ethnic Greeks constituted a very large part of Israelite society. That's not the case. They were a minority and not a very large minority.
It's the language itself that took over. Kind of like where I am in Sydney in Australia, where English is by far the dominant language, and yet actual Anglos are not a minority, but not a big majority either.
Right. Yeah. So we might say that the Greek settlers who did move in had a very disproportional influence on the culture, the economy, and the language. So, and because that is also to say, as the Greek author I mentioned earlier, Isocrates, mentioned, Greek at this point in history doesn't denote an ethnicity or race anymore. It denotes a cultural group, a language group. And we see this actually in the Gospels themselves. So if we go to Mark 7, 7th chapter, verse 26, we read, I only have the Greek text here, but it says that Hetigune en Hellenis syrophonikissa to gyne kai rota of tonhinata dav pominian ekbale ektes thigata of tes. So we read here that Christ comes to a woman, and then Mark notes, but the woman was a Greek, Hellenis. And then he notes, Syrophonikissa, but she was a Syro-Phoenician by ethnicity, Togene. So here we see perfectly the distinction between the ethnic background. She's of Syrian and Phoenician descent, but she's a Greek, Hellenist, because she speaks Greek. She's a Hellene. And so this distinction between ethnic group and language, cultural group is actually also witnessed to by the New Testament itself, because it can only be by her language, it can only be by her culture that she's Greek, when the text is quite explicit that it isn't in her ethnicity or her race. And that's quite interesting, I think, and helps to underscore that this phenomenon was quite common. So even though ethnic Greeks constituted a minority of the population of Israel, Hellenes or Greek-speaking people were much, much more numerous.
And so to summarize this case so far, the background information we have leading up to the 1st century very, very strongly shows that the Greek language itself has thoroughly penetrated Judea, that it's just normal. It's a normal means of speech. Not that Aramaic or Hebrew are never used, but just that Greek itself has become the common tongue.
Yeah,
that's
right.
Basically what's shown right here so far.
Yes, yeah, right. So, and we'll I'll get into this. You might say that this first part is only trying to prove the presence of Greek and how common it was. Then the second part I'll try to show is that it wasn't just common; it was also dominant. But that's a much stronger case, which I'll try to show. But
before you continue, there's one interesting question here. Does Michael interact with Stephen Notley's or Shemuel Safrai's work showing that Hebrew was actually alive and well in the first century?
Yeah, I do actually. In the book I have written about it, I do. And can you save the question, because I want to give a more thorough reply to that?
We'll do. We'll come back to it.
Excellent. Thanks. And very good question. So thanks for asking that. Yeah. So to underscore the Jewish and Greek context of the time of Christ. As we know, Christ grew up in the town of Nazareth in northern Galilee. And Galilee, as even some of the prophets remarked, it was the Galilee of the nations, or the Galilee of the heathens, because, as you might remember, after the exile, only 2 tribes returned from Babylon, that of Benjamin and that of Judah, because the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom had disappeared. They were conquered by the Assyrians and deported out of Israel, and most of the northern Israel were settled by Assyrians and other people groups. So at this time, northern Israel had a very slight Jewish character, we might say, which is also to say that the Greek language then was the means of communication used by all these different groups when they had to communicate together. Because, of course, they all had their own native languages, all their native dialects. But when talking cross-group, cross-tribal identity, then Greek was the language used. And so talking about northern Galilee and the context itself of where Christ grew up, he grew up in a very, very Hellenized part of the Mediterranean. Right next to Nazareth was Tiberias and Caesarea, which were 2 very Hellenized Greek-speaking towns. And what is often also forgotten, the town closest to Nazareth was a very large Greek town called Sepphoris. It was around 6 kilometers or 3.7 miles, for those Americans who might be listening, away from Nazareth. And what is quite interesting was that at the time of during the rule of Antipas, a lot of large construction projects were carried out in Sepphoris, the building of an amphitheater and other public works. And we know that Jesus and Joseph were skilled carpenters or skilled woodworkers. The Greek word denoting their trade is teknon, which is a very broad term, but it denotes some kind of trained, skilled craftsman, probably working in wood or building. So, and this, I grant, this is a speculative argument. So if you're not sympathetic to it, you may disregard it. But I think it would be very reasonable to just note that if you have a lot of very large public building projects going on in a Greek-speaking town, and you have a neighboring village with skilled craftsmen, then they would probably in some way be connected to that work. If for nothing else, they would go to town to trade goods, to go to the marketplace to buy the supplies that the homestead would not be able to show. So we know that the context of Christ's upbringing was quite Greek indeed. Richard Bartley, who's a professor of religion, he wrote that, quote, Jesus lived in a Galilean culture much more urban and sophisticated than previously believed. Sepphoris possessed an amphitheater with 4,000 seating spots. It must be noted, therefore, that when Jesus uses explicit Greek words from a theatrical context, such as hypocritai, hypocrite, then this influence was not limited to Well, what he's arguing here, for some reason, the last sentence of the quote was cut out. But what he's arguing here is that when we have Christ using like very explicit references to Greek culture and language, and we know that he grew up right next to a hub of Hellenism and Greek culture, then we have the cause and we have the effect. We just have to draw the line between them.
Yeah.
He further notes, Richard Badley, that this influence was not limited to the coastal areas, though, and inland cities like Sebaste, Gerasa, and Sepphoris, where archaeological finds such as amphora, Greek seals, characteristic Greek architecture, also for common housing even, has confirmed the broad influence of Hellenism throughout the country. Okay. This was the first part. I think that it has been demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that Greek was at least a very common parcel of daily life in Galilee and in ancient Israel.
Yeah, let's discuss this a bit more. With all this evidence, it's easy to see. Okay, we've got all this evidence with Greek and all that stuff. Someone could come back and say, okay, but what about the evidence of, because of course the primary assumption today being, of course, that Aramaic was the primary language of the time. How does the evidence of the Aramaic language compare to the Greek language in these time periods?
Yeah, right. Yeah, good question. So that's the next part here, because if we grant, as the question does, Greek was present, but was it dominant? I mean, like, for example, you might say that German is very present in British public schools, but it has like a very small influence in society, a very small presence. And even though many Brits might understand like a few sentences of German, of course, then it would be naive to say that German is like a commonly understood and used tongue in British society. So now, having proven that Greek was common and very much present by large population groups in Israel, I will try to show whether it was the dominant language, because as you said, of course, I mean, we know that the indigenous population of these areas, that they spoke Aramaic as a native tongue. But what we have to remember here is that Aramaic speaking.
Bless thee.
Thank you. That Aramaic speaking language skills were restricted to the indigenous population alone. All the settlers, all the tradesmen, all the Roman officials, all the soldiers, all the travelers, and so on, all these other groups would have no reason to learn Aramaic, because Greek was already understood by most native inhabitants. And to prove that point, because that is somewhat of a claim, because we might say, okay, wasn't Greek then just used by...
Yeah. On its own, it's just a supposition.
Right, yeah. Because how do we know that also the indigenous natives understood and spoke Greek? Well, Josephus, the famous Jewish historian, who published his large work, Jewish Antiquities, is of good help here. Not only did he publish that work about Jewish antiquities in Greek, of course, but he also mentions how
really quickly on that, on as well. I've read, I think we've talked about this a little bit before, but I've read elsewhere that he did actually also publish it in Aramaic. Do you know much about that, or?
Yeah, so he didn't publish it in Aramaic, but he wrote that the first draft to it was written in Aramaic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So whether that draft denotes some like notes or outlines or like a larger work, maybe we simply are not aware. We just know that it was published and disseminated in Greek.
Okay. And to answer Jack Ray's question, was Greek the common trade language in Judea at the time? That's pretty much what we're discussing right now. So your question is going to be answered quite thoroughly right now. And also, really quickly before we go on, more important, did Jesus post memes? Well, most certainly. He's the source of many. His sayings are the source of countless memes today. So I'd say absolutely.
I actually think that So okay, this is just like a total digression. I'll try and keep it short, but when we Christians have read the New Testament so many times, and so it kind of like we kind of just skip over it quite easily. Learning Greek and learning to read it in Greek is also helpful because it really
Absolutely.
helps you to slow down the reading. So you're
Hmm.
really chewing through the text.
Hmm.
When I was reading the passage from the Gospel of John about the blind man being healed, and then he came to the Pharisees who interrogated him, and they keep asking him questions about Jesus, like they want to know what is Christ teaching, what is he doing, and so on. And they summon him a second time. And when reading through that passage in Greek, there's a lot of humor in that passage, actually. So in the end, the blind man, having been healed, replies to the Pharisees that if you guys are so interested in Jesus, why don't you just join him and become his disciples? And I mean, reading through that, it was actually quite funny. So though our Lord might have been a bit shy on the meme posting, then at least I'm quite certain that some humor is witnessed to by the New Testament.
Yeah. Oh, as a slight tangent as well, I've heard the hypothesis that the statement of Jesus to the Pharisees that listen to them for they sit on the seat of Moses. I've heard the hypothesis that some say it does seem a bit speculative, even if possible, but speculative that he was being sarcastic, like, "Oh, look at them, they sit on the seat of Moses." I don't know what you think about that. If you ever heard it, or
I don't know that actually, and
it would be funny though.
yeah, it could be very funny. And we do know that Christ like referred to what would have been funny terms like hypocrite. I mean, that's a very specific role in the Greek drama. So yeah, but to put that aside, the question was also asked whether Greek was the language commonly used for trade. I think that's a granted because trade is what we might say like one step further up the social chain compared to maybe like agricultural activities and skilled labor done in the vicinity of a homestead. So when trading, you really have to be able to access all different groups, and we just know that foreigners composed a large minority of Israelite society, and they for sure didn't speak Aramaic. Aramaic was really restricted to the native indigenous population of the area, but now we have been really like talked a lot about it, but not so much to the point. Namely, then was Greek dominant? Was it also spoken and used by the indigenous Aramaic-speaking population? Because I'm not arguing here that Christ did not speak Aramaic. Of course, he grew up with Aramaic. But what I'm also arguing is that practically all inhabitants were bilingual. They all, like all the indigenous Aramaic speakers, were also to some degree proficient in Greek as well. So, and to support that point, Josephus he has an interesting note in his work Jewish Antiquities. He says that during the reign of Julius Caesar, so before Christ, just before like the decades before Christ.
Yeah, like not very long before.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Functionally contemporary.
Yeah, right. Then when some imperial decrees went out from Rome by the order of Julius Caesar, they were erected on bronze tablets in Jerusalem itself, and the bronze tablet had all these imperial decrees written on them. But the very interesting thing then is that Josephus notes that they were inscribed in only two languages. And which languages? We might say, okay, maybe yeah, Aramaic, of course, and then Greek, maybe. But no, actually, they were composed only in Latin and Greek. And that's very interesting because Latin, we might say, was the language of the regime, of the state power, of the Roman structure. But almost nobody spoke Latin except if you had like a lot of dealings with the Romans themselves, and many Romans, at least all high-class Romans, were also fluent in Greek. But what is very interesting then is the second language, because if the choice of Latin is a nod to the imperial power and to the official nature of the decrees coming from the Senate, then the second language must by necessity be that which Rome would expect the inhabitants to understand. And that's very interesting, because if they had chosen Aramaic rather than Greek, then of course all the native Aramaic speaking people would be able to understand it. But you would exclude all the Greek speakers. Yet, if you chose Greek, then you would include both all the Greek speaking people as well as the Aramaic speaking population, because they were also proficient in Greek. They were bilingual. And to underscore that point, I think it's really clear if we look at the disciples of Christ, those weren't, first of all, ethnic Greek, they were Jews. And secondly, they didn't come from like urban elites in Jerusalem or Caesarea or anything. Most of them were ordinary fishermen from Galilee. But if we read about these disciples, then we read that they had names such as Philip, Andreas or Andrew, Peter, Simon, as he was called prior. And this is very interesting because, first of all, Philip and Andreas, those are Greek names, like fully Greek names. It would, and they don't have any precedent in Jewish culture. Likewise, Simon actually, and before we say, oh yeah, but one of Jacob's sons would call Simon and so on. The Jewish name is actually Simeon, and not Simon. Simeon. It's a different spelling. We see that also in Greek, even. For example, in the book of the Maccabees, we see some of the Jewish characters. Their name is giving us Simeon. So when Peter, also known as Simon, is called Simon, he's either using directly a Greek name, as we know from Greek literature. The name Simon was also common in Greece. Or he's using a Greek adaptation of the originally Hebrew name. So either way, we see that even in like lower class or even among the indigenous rural populations, such as for Galilean fishermen, Greek was such a strong part of daily life that it was even something you would name your children. You would even use Greek names to give to your children. And we know that Philip, like Andrew and Peter, grew up either in or very close to Bethsaida. And Bethsaida was a Greek-speaking town as well.
So let's be again.
Yeah, thank you. When you have 3 kids and all the kids are sick and it's a cold spring, it's
oh dear.
Yeah.
I hope you don't spread it over the internet to me, man. I already had my COVID stout and it was not fun.
Oh well, I think it's only a certain type of virus which is able to go through the internet, and not the kind of virus I got. So, anyways, in the 12th chapter of the Gospel of John, we read that this scene takes place in Jerusalem. And we read that some Greeks came to Philip and spoke to him because they wanted to talk with Christ. But these Greeks, either it denotes like Greek-speaking Jews from the diaspora, those gathered for the temple festivals in Jerusalem, or denotes like actual Greek tourists, which were quite common. There were actually quite a big tourist industry in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. We have like small tourist guides written back then, which is quite interesting. But regardless of whether it was Greek-speaking Jews from the diaspora who would have had no knowledge of Aramaic or Hebrew, or whether it was actual Greeks, they come to Philip and speak to him, which of course just shows that Philip was able to speak and communicate in Greek. Likewise, the fisherman Simon Peter, when he meets in the book of Acts, when he comes to the Roman officer Cornelius, we ought to imagine that their conversation took place in Aramaic. That would be ludicrous. He was a Roman Italian. He was from one of the divisions. Maybe, of course, he could have come from one of the imperial provinces. He might not have been a native Italian. But regardless, he would have been able to speak Latin, maybe, or maybe his own native language from the province, but then, in addition, also Greek. because Greek was simply the lingua franca of the whole Eastern Mediterranean. So this conversation taking place between Peter and Cornelius must have been conducted in Greek, as Cornelius would have had no prerequisites to be able to speak Aramaic. And then I must also just appeal to the plain argument that we have their words, we have their conversation written in God's holy word, which is showed in Greek. So I think that's just like
the Bible told me so, therefore Jesus spoke Greek. Done.
But I mean, just like prima facie, we would suppose that it's actually recording real history, what they said. Likewise, the evangelist Matthew, which is a native Jewish name, but he was a tax collector. He would go around to all the different groups of Judea at the time to collect taxes, which would include colonists, tradesmen, carpenters, skilled, and he would be able to conduct his affairs, of course, both in Aramaic to those who were more comfortable with that, but he must by necessity also have been able to speak fluent Greek to be able to effectively work as the local representative of the Roman authority. And we also just have, I mean, his gospel written in a very fine Greek style. Then our last fellow, the evangelist Luke, he was, according to Josephus, a doctor, doctor, and very well educated. To those of you who might be able to read Greek, I mean, reading Saint Luke's gospel in Greek is really a charm. Its style is very much closer to classical Greek than in any of the other New Testament writings. So here we clearly,
I even personally found the prologue a slight bit of a challenge to read. I mean,
yeah,
I'm barely intermediate myself because I've barely like restarted my study again. But even then, I was able to cruise through many bits of other gospels. But then I go to the prologue of Luke. I'm like, bruh, what is this guy saying?
Yeah, right. He's actually imitating. Yeah, remember, guys, get the Byzantine majority text.
Hang on, based. Hang on. Base department?
No, not based. This is the critical text made by liberal German.
Get out.
We need the Byzantine majority text. But regardless, they aren't that different, to be honest. And sadly, I think the discussion has been somewhat ruined by King James onlyist. But we could do a conversation about the most holy and pious Byzantine text recording and transferring the holy words of divine scripture. But regardless, I just wanted to find the introduction because Luke's introduction to his gospel is written in a very high style of Greek, and he's very purposefully imitating many classical Greek authors such as Thucydides. I don't know how to say his name in English. The Greek author of the Peloponnesian Wars, one of the big...
Thucydides.
Yeah, right. Yeah, great. He's imitating a lot of Greek features actually in his prologue.
Interesting.
But yeah, well, regardless, we have here, as we can see, disciples who are fishermen from Galilee being able to speak fluent Greek, whether Peter or Philip. We have other disciples composing large pieces of literature in very good Greek. And I actually think that there's some cooperation to some support to these arguments. So, for example, we have two epistles from Peter in the New Testament. One is written in a very poor Greek style. It's readable. It gets its message across, but the style is clearly of someone unlearned in Greek literature and classical Greek language. But it's fine. It's fine and useful for communicating. Then the second epistle, the other epistle of Peter, is written in a much higher style of Greek. It reads very differently. And this led, in my opinion,
therefore the letters of Peter are fake. They were forgeries,
exactly right.
because they couldn't actually hire a scribe. No way, that just doesn't happen.
Yeah, my point exactly, because I think this was one of the this fact was one of the reasons why some church fathers got the misunderstanding that Peter only wrote one of the epistles. For example, Eusebius says that Second Peter was very dubious in the ancient church, and some of the churches wouldn't even use it because they thought that, oh, the style, the tone of this language is so very different from the first epistle of Peter. But what I think is clearly the case is that he wrote one epistle by himself as well as he could, and the second epistle he dictated to a scribe or another disciple or someone more learned in Greek letters, so that he wrote down in a more stylish tone what Peter said. But if we take that theory, that hypothesis, then we see that Peter was able to communicate by himself fluently in Greek. It might not be the most stylish Greek, but I mean, I'm communicating right now in English, though this is far from some Oxford lecture. But I mean, I'm able, hopefully, to make myself understandable, and I'm at least very good at understanding English when spoken to me. So we also see this in these characters. It's not as if they all went around quoting Greek poems and so on, even though St. Paul does that at times. But
that's another funny evidence people don't think of, the fact that Paul himself was just super good with Greek, and he'd send all his letters in Greek across to all the churches. I mean, that's something as well.
Right, yeah. So, but I think this argument is very poignant insofar as it shows that even rural native Israelites were able to speak and understand and compose whole works of literature in Greek. I mean, St. Luke, he wrote not only the Gospel of Luke, but also the book of Acts. I mean, those reads in maybe, I don't know, 60 chapters or so, long chapters in total. That's a lot of literature. So we mustn't commit the error of trying to restrict the knowledge and usage of Greek only to urban elites, when we have good evidence showing that even rural fishermen were able to speak it. I think that the professor of New Testament studies, Peter van der Horst, he's a Dutch guy. He summarizes it very nicely. He says that for a greater part of the Jewish population, the daily language was Greek, even in Palestine. This is impressive testimony to the impact of Hellenistic culture on Jews in their mother country, to say nothing of the diaspora. In Jerusalem itself, about 40%, not 14, 40% of the Jewish inscriptions from the 1st century period are in Greek. We may assume that most Jewish Jerusalemites who saw the inscriptions in their place were able to read them. In a 1st century tomb near Jericho, a Jewish family nicknamed the Goliathans because of their great height, inscribed more than half of their epitaph in Greek. A majority of the Jews in Palestine and the Western diaspora spoke Greek. This is probably one reason why there is so little evidence of the influence of the Mishnah outside rabbinical circles. And this question
we'll be getting more into that a little bit.
Yeah, we will discuss that. So, in other words, this is my conclusion, where I'm summarizing my position. It's from the book I'm currently writing on the topic. In other words, Greek was the dominant language, though it was not the only language. It did not supplant Aramaic, but it was the primary language with which communication between the nation's different social and cultural groups were enabled. Even in more conservative Pharisaic circles did Greek exert its influence. The Pharisee Nicodemus, which needless to say is a Greek name as well, was a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, which is itself is also a Greek loanword, synhedrion, which again points toward the universal influence of Greek. Also, Paul's Pharisaic teacher, Rabbi Gamaliel, who's mentioned in Acts 22, was himself a Hellenist. His son, Simeon, recounts how the students of Gamaliel devoted themselves to the study of Greek literature. Therefore, it should not surprise that Paul, being a student of Gamaliel, multiple times cites Greek poets such as Menander in 1 Corinthians 15:33, and discusses Greek philosophy in Athens, in Greek naturally, Acts 17, in addition to using Greek rhetoric and stylistic devices. So I think it's important to say that we don't need to overstate our case. Aramaic did not disappear. Aramaic was widely spoken, but Israel and the native inhabitants of Israel were not monolingual. They were bilingual, speaking Aramaic as well as Greek. So when we come to Christ himself, as I argued, that he conducted his public ministry in Greek, then this question is very important because we must ask ourselves, do we actually have access to the very, very words of Christ himself? Are we able to read the utterances of our Lord, or have they come to us through the lens of a translator and the original, very divine words themselves having been lost to the passing of history? A very sentimental argument I jokingly chatted with you earlier was that
based on the truth,
based on
facts,
truth,
I mean,
based on the Bible, that would be that Christ promised us that a sheep will hear its shepherd's voice. And when reading the dialogues and the sweet words of Christ, I think most believers somehow can feel that the very voice of Christ is speaking to them. That's at least my feeling. Of course, that is, I think, to be fair, that is not an argument that can be used to convince. But I do think it's a fair point which can help one to find support for these claims inwardly in a certain manner. It's not a point that can be used to convince others, and I won't try to use it to convince others. But I think it's a point that can help to strengthen the claim of those who have been already convinced. But having shown, sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
Yeah. So having shown that ancient Israel was a bilingual society and not a monolingual society, it should be quite obvious that that included Christ too, because Christ's public ministry was never restricted to Jews. I mean, we have him speaking to large mixed crowds all the time. So many in the crowds would have been Greek speakers, unable to understand or use Aramaic. And when addressing like mixed crowds, it has always been the case that one would switch to the commonly understood language. So, for example, in Denmark, when addressing a group of like foreign exchange students and Danes, you would of course always do that in English because you suppose that is the common language being understood by everyone. So what is also important to note here is that we actually have a few Aramaic words written down in the Holy Gospels, which have come from Christ's mouth himself. For example, he speaks to a little girl, Talitha kum, rise up, little girl, and that's Aramaic. But this is quite interesting and actually a strong support in the favor of Greek being the language of Christ's public ministry, because we see that every time Christ uses Aramaic, it is carefully noted by the evangelist to write it down and translate it. Why, we might ask? Well, because that was extraordinary. That was out of the norm. That was something new which they weren't used to, so they took special note to write it down. Because, again, the presupposition running through the text is that the public language used by Christ is Greek. And then it also makes perfect sense why he would switch to Aramaic when addressing a little girl, because that is, first of all, a private setting in the house, in the home of this family, and he's addressing a minor, a small girl, who might not have been proficient in Greek yet, still having a very young age, but she would have been able to understand Aramaic. So he switches that language code from Greek to Aramaic to address her.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and so in the time following Christ, I mean, many of you might have heard of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. It was a very large rebellion taking place after the Jewish wars by a self-proclaimed Jew who thought himself to be the true Messiah. So we pretty much know how that rebellion went, being a false Messiah and all. But the Bar Kokhba rebellion is very interesting because there are some strong parallels to the Maccabean revolt, because Bar Kokhba, he also tried to resurrect, so to say, spoken Hebrew and written Hebrew, so as to tie tighter together the Jewish nation in this great crisis. And so many of the letters written by the different military attachés and armies and commanders and political figures of the revolt were composed in Hebrew. That has led some scholars to believe that spoken Hebrew was still quite common at the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt. But what is very interesting is that, well, first of all, this is a very purposeful choice of Hebrew for political and political reasons and reasons of ideology, because you want to establish
political and ideological. Yep.
Right. Thank you. This is a First Peter English equivalent. So he wanted to connect a very tight parallel between the ancient Davidic kingdom and the divinely established kingdom of the Bar Kokhbas. So what is very fascinating then is that we actually have found a stash of letters buried in a sack in the desert. And there are around 15 letters. Most of them, are written in Aramaic or Hebrew. A few of them actually are written in Greek also. But one of the letters, which is very interesting indeed, is that it's called P Tadin 252. It denotes where it was found.
Could you say that again?
Yeah, I can put it in the chat if you want to.
Yeah, please do, because that letter sounds fascinating when you told me about it. Perfect, got it. Okay, Matt, awesome. Yeah, keep going.
And this letter is written in Greek, and it says in the letter, "Egραφé de Hellenisti dia to humas me eureke ine hebraisti." This letter is written in Greek because we couldn't find a way to write it in Hebrew, or more literally, because to us, no way, it wasn't found to write it in Hebrew. This is very interesting indeed, because it shows how artificial the choice of Hebrew was. It was something akin to like the German government insisting on using Gothic Fraktur script, because it hails back to a more stronger Germanic past, but it's pretty difficult to read unless you're very used to it. I mean, I read Fraktur, but when I'm trying to show some of my old books to my friends, they're not able to read it. So, for example,
pulling out the stuff.
So, for example, I have this great book by one of my favorite theologians, Jesper Brockmann, and this book was printed in 1778, so quite an old one. But so,
whoa.
But I mean,
bloody hell.
Yeah. So my point is just that.
Whoa. So what language is this?
Well, it's in Danish.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
But I mean,
That's cool.
I don't know any Dane who would be able to just pick that up and read it. I mean, unless they were trained in it.
And you, how good are you at reading it?
Oh, I read it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mad.
Yeah. So, so my point is just that the choice of Hebrew had much more to do with culture, nostalgia, and ideology than it had to do with anything practical. And that means that even in the military camp of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, at times it wasn't possible to find anyone who could write in Hebrew because it was such a rare skill, restricted to a very few learned and religious groups and maybe high-class members of society. Yet, on the other hand, what was the alternative then? Oh, we might as well just choose the most practical language, being Greek. I mean, because note, this isn't even written in Aramaic. It's written in Greek. So I think this shows that just how inescapable the conclusion is when even the most fervent Jewish nationalists have to embarrass themselves by writing Greek, the language of their enemies, even. And when they put such a strong emphasis on the importance of Hebrew language. Letizia Revia from the University of Torino has studied the Bar Kokhba letters in depth, and she concludes that, quote, scholars acknowledge that Hebrew, was hardly ever spoken anymore. That's, of course, Hebrew and not Aramaic. Aramaic was certainly spoken widely, but I think this really helps to undergird the conclusion. Secondly, a different stash of letters were also found quite close to the Bar Kokhba letters. That collection of letters is called the Babatha letters. And it's a collection of 36 letters. And they didn't come from anyone familiar with anyone associated with the Bar Kokhba rebellion. We actually don't know where the letters come from. But they were probably buried around the time of unrest during the war, though. But what is interesting about these letters is that they are almost all of them are written in Greek, and what they're dealing with is only like very personal matters. They're dealing with like receipts for purchases. What's the term for, like, you have a deed when you buy a house to prove you're the owner of the house?
Oh, well, like a deed, I guess. I mean,
okay, that's a deed, right? Yeah.
It would be a deed. Yeah,
it's like deeds, receipts, small private letters with like everyday business, and almost all of them are written in Greek. I think this really helps to put into perspective that compared to the Bar Kokhba letters, which express like a really small niche driven by politics and ideology, then when we finally found something more representative of daily life in Palestine, in Israel at this point in history, then almost all of it is conducted in Greek, because that was just the universal lingua franca. Especially when you need to have something semi-official, such as a house deed to prove ownership, then that is something which is traded, bought or sold, and you can't expect it only to be shared by other Aramaic speakers. So the natural choice of language would just be Greek.
Wow, this is fascinating. That is very fascinating. I actually want to add one more piece of evidence. I don't know if you've seen it, but have you heard of the Theodotus inscription?
Can you give some context to that?
So an inscription from which I believe has actually been dated to the 1st century, and incidentally, it's a proof pretty much that synagogues existed in like the 1st century period.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And that inscription basically detailed like the patron who constructed the synagogue. And sure enough, I won't spoil anything. Let me open up the tab. What language is this?
Hooray!
More Greek, and I've got the English text right here, so I can actually read it. It's very significant when you think about it. So it says, Theodotus, son of Vatanus, priest and head of a synagogue, son of a head of a synagogue, grandson of a head of a synagogue, built the synagogue for the reading of the law and for the teaching of the commandments, and the guest house and the adjoining rooms and the water installations as a lodging for those in need from abroad, the synagogue which his fathers and the elders of Simonides founded. So the actual inscription denoting the building of a synagogue in first century Judea. So basically the clubhouse for the Jew boys, like all the Jew boys, this is where they come. It's in Greek. So there you go.
Yes,
Really cool, really fascinating.
Yeah, right.
And so to kind of cap this all off, so we looked at a couple of examples in from the Gospels, which you believe.
Well, before we go there, I have like.
Okay. No, as I was going to say, we have already looked at some of those gospel examples. But if you have any others you want to bring up,
yeah, sure. Because
what did you want to say first?
Yeah, there maybe I have 5 minutes left of further evidence to pile on the stack, and I still
by
have.
By all means, go for it. Dump it all on us, mate. Dump it.
And I think I have maybe one more arrow in my quiver of my scholars.
Most scholars.
Yeah, please don't get me wrong. I really hate people who just quote mine a bunch of liberal scholars, but. So please forgive me. That's not my intent. That's not my intent here. But but what I do think is fair is to say that I think this is one of the most poignant episodes of the New Testament in regards to this case, at least. In the Gospel of John, after the big scene in Jerusalem, the Jews are discussing amongst themselves, and they say that, quote, "Where does he," that is Christ, "intend to go, that we shall not find him? Does he intend to go to the diaspora among the Greeks and teach the Greeks?" End quote. So,
could you repeat that again? So, could you repeat that again so I could soak in?
Yes, right. So, yeah, we should just. I'll just find the passage real quick now. So it's from the John chapter 7. John chapter 7, verse 35.
Okay.
So reading from the text of St. John, it says, "Then the Jews said among themselves, 'Where does he intend to go, that we shall not find him? Does he intend to go to the diaspora among the Greeks and teach the Greeks?'" This is quite interesting because Christ has just talked about how he will go and they won't be able to find him. And the Jews then speculate, okay, does that mean he will continue his ministerial ministry among the Jews in the dispersion? Maybe go to Alexandria, Antiochia, or to Greece, to all the different synagogues and Jews, which we read about in the Acts of the Apostles, where St. Peter and Paul preached to when they taught in the synagogues. But what is like the obvious presupposition here is that, of course, Christ must have been able to speak fluent Greek. Otherwise, he couldn't travel to the diaspora and teach the Greeks if he didn't speak Greek, because all of them were Greek-speaking. No Jew in the diaspora still retained the usage of spoken Aramaic or Hebrew at this point, at least not in the Eastern Mediterranean basin. So I think this is just also like very, very strong support. So my last scholar, H.C. Key, he draws this conclusion. He says that this means that for Jesus to have conversed with the inhabitants of cities in Galilee, and especially the cities of the Decapolis and the Phoenician region, he would have had to know Greek, certainly at the conversational level. And I think I would even go a bit further and emphasize this claim even more. But I mean, this is also just to show that this isn't some French viewpoint. I think this is like pretty mainstream in the scholarship. And the scholarship, of course, might be all wrong. They're wrong on so many issues. But I hope to have given you some good support and some good evidence to underscore the usage of Greek, not only in Judea in the first century by rural Galileans and rural inhabitants, but also, more importantly, by the very Lord himself. And
fantastic. Yeah.
And to just like do a sneak peek to our next episode, we're gonna discuss
That's right.
the Septuagint in a week or two. And I think the last best argument for the usage of Greek by our Lord is that in Luke's Gospel, chapter 4, when he enters the synagogue, is handed the scroll of Isaiah. Then he reads it out in Greek. It's literally verbatim, word for word, the Greek text of the Septuagint he's reading in the synagogue. And we know that the Septuagint, that is like the Greek translation of the Old Testament, was used throughout synagogues. We have found many copies of the Septuagint in ancient Israel, dating from this period. So it was commonly used. But when he's reading the prophecy of Isaiah, he's following the wording of the Septuagint, which again just shows that he spoke Greek, he read Greek, and Greek was so common that it was the language, at least of many synagogues in ancient Israel. Well, not ancient, but antique Israel. Do you distinguish between like the very early prior times?
Yeah. It's often called, like, for the Old Testament period, it's often just called ancient Israel.
Yeah.
And then for the New Testament Roman period, it'd be called like Judea or Palestine. Those would be the distinctions, I guess, with terms.
Okay, far done then. That was quite a mouthful.
Not gonna lie, I was kind of expecting that you go through, I'd say something and back and forth and all that, but you just dumped that case. You just dumped that case all around, and fire. It's actually pretty amazing. And I can pretty much see myself. Like, I'd love to check out these sources myself to make like absolute certain, because that's me. It's a good kind of historian autism. You got to check the sources for yourself to make sure that that it's actually the case.
And I need to sell some books. So
yeah, you do, absolutely, bro. Can't wait till you get that done. I'll definitely plug that book and I'll buy it myself. I cannot, or you can send me a review copy. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But but I cannot wait for this. But I reckon to kind of contextualize this, to really get an understanding of the scale of the dominance of Greek. I asked at the beginning, and you said we could address this towards the end.
Yeah.
What is how much in comparison is this is the commonality of Aramaic? So in comparison to this, and this ties in with Johnny F's question, which you wanted to interact with towards the end. So I guess we can kind of answer this first, and then we can get into Johnny's question on those specific scholars. So in comparison to the Greek evidence, how great is the evidence for the speaking of Aramaic in Judea at the same time?
I mean, it's sufficient, to put it shortly. We have letters. For example, when I said that most letters were written in Hebrew from the Bar Kokhba rebellion, that includes some in Aramaic. When I said almost all the letters of the other collection of letters were written in Greek, that also includes a few in Aramaic. We have the words of Christ himself being in Aramaic, like his comment to the small girl. What is quite confusing in this conversation is that often in Greek sources, the word Hebrew can denote either Aramaic or Hebrew proper. But I mean, we know that Aramaic was spoken. We know it was a common language and used by many. But what we also know is that its usage was restricted to native inhabitants only.
Got ya. And actually, okay, no, this is the perfect time. So to address this now, you interact with Stephen Notley and Shmuel Safrai. What's your take on them?
Yes, yeah. So this is a very good point. So to summarize their argument, so we actually see that when we talk about Hebrew proper, that is not Aramaic but actual Hebrew, like the language spoken by Moses, Isaiah, and so on. When we see Hebrew, we see that it does undergo some development through time. And what is that is characteristic of a living language. If you have a dead language, you have a language that has stopped evolving. I mean, so for example, Koine Greek doesn't evolve anymore. It's not spoken by anyone. But like a living Greek, like the language of the inhabitants of Greece today, that is an evolving, changing language. So if there's change, organic change in a language, we might say it is living in a certain sense. Now, then what these two scholars try to do is that they point to certain features we see in, for example, some of these letters, in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, and other rabbinical sources, very early sources, and they pinpoint features which are either actual like organic developments of a spoken language or something very close to it. So let's, for the sake of argument, grant that Hebrew does show signs of organic development in the 1st and the 2nd century. Now that would, of course, in a very real sense, presuppose that it was a living language. And if it's a living language, you would need to have native speakers. I think that argument is quite faulty for a number of reasons. It is so because we can actually see the exact same parallel in medieval Latin in Europe. So, for example, if we take the Latin of late antiquity, for example, that of the Carolingian Renaissance with Alcuin at the court of Charlemagne.
Charlemagne, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We just call him Karl the Great in Danish and German. But regardless, we actually see that Latin also changes, shows organic features, like some of the words, the semantic range of certain words shifts. The pronunciation changes very much. I mean, we get like ecclesiastical Latin, which is pronounced differently. And we also have like, we don't really have that much this anymore, but back in medieval times, French and Latin were pronounced differently than Danish or German Latin, for example. And likewise, we also have new words that pop up during the medieval time, quidditas and different words. The spelling is also changing, and so on. So if we came back from the future in 1,000 years and saw this development, we might have very good evidence showing that Latin was a living, naturally evolving language in the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th century. And that is, of course, to a certain extent true, because many parts of society did speak Latin fluently and communicated in it. But it was in this half state between a dead and a living language. It didn't have any...
Yeah, it was a highly academic and liturgical language.
Exactly right. So its usage would be restricted to the nobility, to some traders, diplomats, artists, because we even have secular songs written in Latin, like Tempus Adest Floridum is a famous secular song written in Latin, probably by just some random artist. But regardless, my point here is that you can have a language which shows pseudo signs of organic development without actually being a living language. And I think that the parallel between Latin in medieval Christianity and Hebrew in 1st and 2nd century Israel are very strong, because it is a language widely spoken by the religious elite in the religious context. It is a language nurtured for its historic and cultural value, but it doesn't have really any native speakers. And by native speakers, I mean people who are raised with Hebrew as their mother tongue.
Mm-hmm. Far out. That's awesome. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I've seen that's actually kind of been my it was kind of slight like my pet theory with the Gospel of Matthew bit, for example, assuming Papias of Hierapolis's testimony, because as you said, when they talk about Hebrew, it could mean Hebrew and Aramaic, but I had the thought once that like assuming that by Hebraisti he literally meant Hebrew, it could make sense as like his gospel being composed in Hebrew and he sent it to the religious elite to say, hey, the Messiah's here, come and follow him, which would make perfect sense. Speaking of which, Aramaic Matthew, what's your take? Yeah. The testimony of Papias.
Yes, very glad you bring it up. So the issue here, for those unfamiliar with that question, is that we have many church fathers bearing witness to the fact that Hebrew was actually a language, at least of one edition of Matthew's gospel. So in Josephus' church history, He's quoting one of the very earliest church fathers, an author named Papias, who was, according to tradition, taught by Saint John himself. And he mentions that in that quotation from Papias that Matthew composed a gospel in Hebrew. The quoting, to be more exact, is that, so then Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language, and everyone interpreted them as he was able. And a different quote from the same author goes, for Matthew, who had at first preached to the Hebrews, when he was about to go to the other peoples, committed his gospel to writing in his native tongue, and thus compensated those whom he was obliged to leave for the loss of his presence. This second quote is Josephus summarizing the position of Papias.
Eusebius, you mean? Eusebius?
Yeah, Eusebius. Yeah, sorry.
Yep.
Yeah, sorry, right. Eusebius. And I think this is exactly what happened. So Matthew, when he had, because the original disciples didn't leave Palestine like just after Pentecost or something. They stayed and preached and did their ministry entrusted to them by Christ himself. But when they had to leave because of persecution, the Jewish wars, the destruction of Jerusalem, and so on, according to Eusebius, Matthew wrote a gospel down in Hebrew. But notice he says that he committed his gospel to writing in his native tongue. When Eusebius says native tongue here, he must by Hebrew mean Aramaic, because Aramaic was the native tongue of Matthew. So, and it says that he committed his gospel to his native tongue. That is to say, he translated his gospel, which was already present. I believe it was written maybe in the 50s or 60s at latest, the Gospel of Matthew. So when the Gospel is written already in Greek at this date, but when he has to leave Israel, then he makes a Hebrew, or that is Aramaic, translation of his Gospel to share with his native countrymen.
Wow, very interesting. So basically reversing the normally understood order of Papias, where it says Papias says put down in Hebrew or Aramaic, and then others translate as best they could. But then in this case, Matthew did originally write in Greek, but then you reckon he actually translated it back into Aramaic.
Right.
Because just to give like a mild pushback, because it just sounds like from that passage that it just sounds like from the outset he established that gospel in Hebrew/Aramaic. That's how it sounds like when I read it. What do you say?
Yeah, so the quotation from Papias given to us by Eusebius is, quote, so then Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language, and everyone interpreted them as he was able to. There is, it's the word hamenenos in the Greek, like to translate, interpret. Yeah. Those words are the same in Greek, so it could be either interpret or translate. Yeah. But this is the quotation from Papias given by Eusebius. We don't know the context, or we are only given like this very short sentence, while we know that Eusebius had access to all the writings of Papias. So to get the context and to understand what is the relationship of this gospel in Hebrew to the Greek gospel, then I think Eusebius' own summary must be the one we go to, because he had access to all Papias' writings. And what Eusebius says is the following, quote, for Matthew, who had at first preached to the Hebrews, when he was about to go to other peoples, committed his gospel to writing in his native tongue, and thus compensated those whom he was obliged to leave for the loss of his presence. So it would be my point that the commitment of the gospel to his native tongue was something which took place after he had written the Greek, which is the official edition. Because, I mean, if we grant that there existed like a whole Hebrew or Aramaic gospel, which was like the officially shared one, then it's almost impossible to imagine that it just disappeared. Also from the Syriac church, whose liturgical language is Aramaic. So I don't think that would make sense of the data. But if it was kind of like a farewell gift or a nod to his own native countrymen, written in the shadow of the official Greek gospel, then it would make sense for it to be lost in history.
Kinda, maybe. I don't know. Maybe that's definitely another discussion. That's definitely another wide discussion for another time. My personal thing when I thought about it was that to explain it was assuming it came with Aramaic first. My personal thing, at least with explaining, well, how come it looks so similar to the other gospels then if it was in Aramaic first and then translated afterward? My kind of thing would have been like, did an Aramaic first, and then with his Greek version, he basically went back to like whether the original notes or the other gospels to basically get the original Greek words and just put them back where the Aramaic was originally. So that's kind of like my personal pet theory. But those are good points. Those are definitely points to to think about. I reckon it's possible that if it was originally in Aramaic and then put into Greek afterwards, it's possible the Aramaic could have dropped off. Actually, that's getting into a whole nother tangent. I think I could go for 12 years with this, but
yeah,
either way.
I just think my point would be that if the first officially published Gospel of Saint Matthew was in Aramaic, then I just find it impossible to imagine that it would have died out. But if it was something written subsequent to the official Greek Gospel, and in the shadow of the prominence of the Greek edition, then it seems much more reasonable that we don't have any copies of the Greek Gospel anymore, of the Aramaic Gospel anymore.
Right, fair enough. I personally think it might have just literally just actually gone out into obscurity, depending on who it was sent to, if it was an Aramaic original. But that's this ends up getting into the territory of supposition. But either way, this is great, very good stuff. Very, very interesting take on the Gospel of Matthew, because of course you'll hear our fellow Christian apologists going very, very much on the testimony of Papias and say, hey, it's originally in Hebrew. And then your unbelievers are like, oh, we don't have the original Aramaic, Hebrew, mustn't have existed, therefore gospel authorship anonymous, all that bull crap. But then, of course, when we do actual history and don't just assume skepticism on early Christian sources because it might challenge our little atheism, we can actually get some good work done with this. We don't have to scramble for every little bit of evidence and try to make sure it all stays upright. We can critically examine anything, because if we don't assume hyper-skepticism, we are perfectly reasonable in saying that either we're misinterpreting Papias, we don't have his context, or he or Eusebius or whoever got something wrong, and yet nonetheless the testimony is very much strong and early enough that Matthew did indeed write this gospel. So there you go. That works either way. But this is good stuff. This is very good stuff. And I think there's a couple of objections. I think a couple of the objections I kind of had already, like you basically answered those already. Like, well, indirectly, but kind of directly. Like one of my objections, potential objections I was going to give was with the existence of the Mishnah, the Gemara, and thus the Talmud, generally speaking, how they read Hebrew. It's kind of just I just tried to come up with some objections, but obviously it's a very silly objection, because like the existence of Latin in academic context in the Middle Ages doesn't therefore disprove that people spoke German in Germany. I mean, so it's a very silly objection to think about that one. But again, it's just a hypothetical one. But one I can think of, which I'd like to hear your take on, is that there's a good number of Aramaisms in the Gospels, in the Greek Gospels. And for people who don't know, Aramaism, or just a Hebraism or Latinism or whatever, basically a style of a language, but not necessarily in that same language. So an Aramaism in this case in the Gospels would be Aramaic styles of speech in the Greek Gospels. So given the presence of many Aramaisms in the Gospels, such as the many times when Jesus says, Amen, Amen, lego humin, truly, truly I say unto you, given the presence of those, wouldn't that possibly suggest that the conversations were originally in Aramaic?
Yes. When one considers that point, which you brought up, I actually think it's another argument for the widespread use of Greek, because when you have a lot of, let's say, ethnic Greek speakers Like, for example, if we took a time machine and traveled to Athens, and together with Paul, and when we spoke Greek with the native inhabitants of Athens, then nobody would use Aramaicisms or like features or the syntax of Semitic languages, because they would all be native Greek speakers. Likewise, for example, when we have like what might we say, when we have like pure Greek composition in the New Testament, for example, the prologue of Luke, or other pieces of pure Greek composition, then we don't find any Aramaisms either, because it's just the Greek, the natural flow of the Greek language. Yet, if we have large population groups acquiring Greek as a second language, then a lot of their native language will color and give a certain kind of texture or sense or feel to the way they use their new language. For example, surprise, I don't know if any of you noticed it, but English is not my native language. So the way I use English, the way I pronounce it, the way some of my wording is very much colored by my Danish, which is my native tongue. So even though I am speaking English, it is English which is heavily influenced by the Danish glasses through which I acquired the language. Likewise, when we have large groups of native Aramaic speakers picking up Greek and learning to speak Greek fluently, it is, of course, a Greek which will be colored by their own native language.
That makes sense. Yeah, that definitely makes a ton of sense. And like even just doing the bit I do in learning languages myself, it's very easy for cross pollination between the languages when you speak. It's super easy. You could get, like, I remember even one time doing just some casual natural Greek typing and all that stuff on like a group chat, and one of the guys called me out for, I don't think it was deliberate, but for basically doing like an English calc, or like wording things as saying something as I would in English, just with Greek words. And so it's very easy for it to come across. And of course, in the case of Aramaisms and all, it doesn't have to break the rules of the language. It just colors what it looks like. So if anything, it does actually make a lot of good sense of the Greek hypothesis, rather, the Greek dominance hypothesis, Jesus speaking Greek. The fact that we have these little bits of Aramaic, like both literal Aramaic and then Aramaisms in the Greek taken together, does actually seem to suggest that the original speech was as it is. So yeah, that does make a lot of sense, because with a normal translation, keyword normally, so not necessarily, they want to make it look like the target language, you know. So yeah, it does actually seem to be original in this case. And I wonder if I had any other potential objections, blah blah blah, all that stuff. No, not really. Pretty much the other ones I sent over, you answered. But there's another one right here by my boy Johnny F. Good to see you, buddy. It's actually been a while, I think. He says the proper context for interpreting the parables is rabbinic mishalim, which are 100% in Hebrew. How does Michael account for this?
Yeah, so I am. This might also be my own personal sympathies shining through, but as a general note, I think it's a horrible hermeneutical lens to try and read New Testament Christianity through rabbinic lenses. That's almost a whole show. Not that it's always wrong, but generally it is.
Probably get banned from YouTube for anti-Semitism, but yeah.
Wow, yeah. Right. Even the Roman Catholic American magazine just published an editorial about how we can't read the Gospel of John anymore on Passion Friday because.
Oh my gosh! Yeah, that was so funny.
I'm in good company, at least. I mean, if anyone has read John Chrysostom's 6 orations against the Jews, then I mean, I am probably the greatest lover of Israel compared to some of the church fathers. But taking that aside, of course, it must be said that when reading rabbinic literature, of course, there are a lot of cultural context, a lot of good insights being carried over, which can be very helpful and illuminating when we read the Gospels. But that said, saying that in the proper context for interpreting the parables, I would say that's wholly wrong. I mean, the fables of Aesop, I don't know the English term for that Roman author. Do you know that it's a famous Aesop?
Oh, Aesop, so Aesop.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I've heard of him. Yeah.
So his fables, for example, has a lot of parallels to some of the parable literature, and we also find that in other Greek literature. So of course there might be something in the Meshalim and this kind of Jewish wisdom genre which can help to interpret the words of Christ. But I mean, it's I would say it's hit or miss. I mean, it's the wisdom passed on by the sect whose defining factor was the rejection of Christ. So I mean, I wouldn't really use them as a truth guide at all. But also because one really needs to be careful when trying to draw a relationship between Judaism at the time of Christ and then the later development of rabbinic Judaism, because
there's a lot of difference.
Judaism at the time of Christ was such a different animal indeed than rabbinic Judaism, and that's something we would talk about for a whole hour. So when plugging out small snippets of rabbinic literature and then using them as some great grand lens to interpret Holy Scripture, I think some very problematic conclusions can be drawn from that.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's almost, but not quite, but almost the same mindset with how like the Masoretic text, that's the word. It can't be challenged. You can't challenge the Masoretic text. It's the authentic Jewish stuff. It's the good stuff.
I think we're going to talk a lot more about that later.
Oh, we are, because ladies and gentlemen, this is technically like not really a prologue. It's a thing in its own right. But this interview is also set up for our next part, where already Michael here has given a very spicy take that Greek was the OG language of Judea at the time of Christ. And he's going to be giving the even more spicy take, especially being a committed Lutheran Protestant himself, that the Septuagint is the best preserved, basically, edition of the Holy Scriptures of the Old Testament, even better than the likes of the Masoretic text. So that's going to be an even spicier stream in many ways. So this, in some respects, is a setup for that, because as you mentioned, there's the argument that Jesus very, 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 very often quotes from the Septuagint, and rather than have to do the possible but extra steps interpretation of saying, oh, well, he originally quoted the Hebrew and then the gospel authors just gave the Septuagint equivalent and all that jazz. Rather than having to do that.
Because the gospel authors didn't really care that much about the words coming out of the mouth of Christ. Whatever. We're just going to write whatever we feel like.
Masoretic, Isaiah says this in the Hebrew, but he also said it's quite different in the Greek version. Let's do it. Let's change it up, boys. And extra stick, you are totally right. Michael has a based take. He has many based takes. He has so many based takes. It's not funny. For one, he's Protestant, so that's just based.
An official shout out to my friend Extra Stick. He's one of my great confessional Lutheran friends.
Oh, based. There you go. Very based. Very based. And a fellow member of the legendary Discord, ladies and gentlemen. Link below, the Theocrat Lounge. Join it. It is fantastic. It is popping off these days. It is fantastic. Jack Ray. And by the way, people, there's a Q&A right now, so please, we're going to have some little casual chat while we get some more questions. While we get questions, dump them in right now, any questions you have. And I think there's a couple above, so I'll take a look as well. But Jack Ray says, Rabbinic Judaism is after 70 AD. Seems a bit late for interpreting Jesus' parables. And in that case, not necessarily, because the Midrash, the Gemara and all that, I mean, sorry, not the Midrash, the Mishnah and the Gemara and all that, they do preserve accounts and statements from people at the time of Christ. So they can be useful in that respect for historical context. But apart from that, using them for interpreting parables, which like just by their definition, they're made ad hoc by Jesus on the like just for when he's saying it. So it's not really going to be a big help just to look at, hey, what do these later Christ rejecting Jews say about like, I don't know, sheep and prodigal sons and all that. It's not going to be a whole ton of help. They built that tradition up over 100 years after that. Now definitely with the much later rabbinic Judaism, 100% true. That was just absolute abomination. I like to personally consider myself, hopefully this doesn't get my channel nuked, but the modern religion of Judaism, I like to consider, because people like to always say, even many Christians, normally Christians will like to say that, Christianity, it was Judaism from Moses to Jesus, and then Christianity came out. That was like the next step, if even that. But actually, well, no, if we think about it, Judaism, I like to coin it as a post-Second Temple heresy when you think about it. Christianity was, I think it's Ignatius himself who said it, that Christianity always was the Christian faith. Moses was a Christian, the prophets were a Christian, Abraham was a Christian, all that jazz, even if the fullness hadn't yet been revealed to them. But if we're going to say that we are the religion of Israel, then Israel was Christian by definition, just to use the label to denote the same religion. And Judaism, as we know it today, is an aberration from that. There's no real way around that. And you being a Lutheran, of course, I'm sure you would agree.
Right, yeah. I think it was Irenaeus who said that Judaism... Ignatius.
Yep.
Who said that Judaism is a corruption of Christianity. And that is a
so.
very, very certain sense true. I mean, I often make the comparison to the many Jews who rejected Moses during the Exodus and were cut off from the people of Israel and swallowed up by the ground, we read. I mean, were they Jews then if they had gone off to form their own religious sect? Well, obviously not, because the revelation continued through Moses. If like some sects of Israelite society would reject Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so on, they wouldn't be Jews in the proper sense, because they would reject revelation. And likewise, modern Jewry is an empty shell, really. I mean, they can't even obey the law of Moses because the temple is gone. There's no priesthood, no sacrifice, nothing. Yeah. It's like an empty religion. The content has rotted away because, Christ made all things new. The new covenant has been revealed by God himself. So, it's... I really think one has to be careful when trying to go to the synagogue to understand the church. It should always
like, there's just for pure soberly historical reasons, like going to contemporary Jewish sources, that has historical value. It can, like, for example, if you want to look at the when Jesus talks about the Korban rule in Mark, and then we can look in the Mishnah, what do they say about the Korban rule? What was this thing? And then you look at it, it's like, oh gosh, ew, no wonder Jesus opposed it. But then, of course, later Judaism, utterly useless, 100%. Like, people like to say, oh, I'm going to be nuanced about things. But no, in this case, we don't need nuance. Using later Judaism to interpret Christian faith, fake news, crap, bull, don't need to do it at all. We don't need that. We've got the Bible. We've got the original text. We've got the historical context. We've got the church fathers in many respects. I don't exactly need a rabbi who denies the Messiah. So, yeah, there you go. Oh man. Apart from that, doesn't look like there's people sending in questions. I reckon we give it maybe like a couple more minutes, and if more questions don't end up coming, because a lot of people are asleep right now. It's not the best time for Americans. But if more questions don't come in a few minutes, then we may just jump straight to the interview.
Yeah, we should just do that then, because I mean, if people have questions, they can subscribe to my brilliant new YouTube channel and then ask me.
Yes, I've got the link right above. I'm going to highlight it again. It is right here. Whoop, hang on. It is right here. Michael's channel. That's the link up above in the live chat. And I believe I have linked it in the stream itself as well. So if you want to look in the description, you can find it right there. Go subscribe to him. It is thanks to me that he has jumped 50 subscribers in one day. So very good on to him. Very good on to you, Michael. Prosperous channel indeed. And agreed with Jack Ray. He liked that first video, and I liked it as well. Very nice and simple. Very nice and thorough response to major issues. I cannot wait. Actually, while we wait for any questions, if anyone does have some, what's the next video?
Yeah, so the next video is going to be a presentation of the scriptural case for the evangelical understanding of justification by faith alone apart from works. And it will also be a refutation of the too often made claim that the evangelical understanding of justification succumbs to a sort of nude legal fiction where it's just some declarative reality. It's just some sort of declaration without any basis in reality. I think that's a really bad myth. I will present in the video. It's actually already recorded, so in the video I did present it, but it's not published yet. But in the video I try to offer what is the metaphysical cause of the justification of the justice of the believer in Christ. I mean, what is the metaphysical reality, so to say? How is it that we are in Christ truly just, and our justice consists not in the righteousness of good works or eternal change, but in the real, actual righteousness of God Himself. So it's a bit longer video.
No longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me.
Yeah, right. Philippians 3. But yeah, so it's a bit longer video. It's an hour, but I hope it will be well received.
100%. I think it's gonna be fantastic. Just knowing what I've heard from it already, and it's that kind of video that's as I mentioned to you earlier, that's like becoming the norm now with online apologetics and dialogue between the different Christian traditions, where it's just a normal presentation, but it's something that someone can listen to in the background while they're walking, or in my case, while I'm playing Stellaris or the new Lego Star Wars, and so it's fun stuff. It's really, really good. But it looks like, and hang on, how many subs? You're at 59 subs. Bloody hell, you're at 59 subs right now. That's awesome.
Nice. So let's go to the meme review then.
I think so. Let's jump straight to that meme review. Let me open up the window. Share screen, window. Here we are. Meme review. We're here right now, ladies and gentlemen. Hey, I was going to randomly ask, how closely related are you guys to like Swedes? I guess, like how close?
Oh, very close. It's
very.
Almost the same.
Can you, like, if someone was just to speak pure Swedish in front of you, could you pick up something?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect.
I mean,
there you go.
If you speak Danish, well, then Norwegian and Swedish are pretty much the same language. It's just dialects of a common Scandinavian language. Some words are different. Like, so for example, the Danish word for ice means duck in Swedish. So or something like that. I don't
so there can be some weird bits. Yeah,
but apart from that, it's the same.
Fair enough. So. Curious, do you ever watch PewDiePie, or have you ever watched PewDiePie?
Nah, not really.
Oh well,
my wife does. Yeah, I think it's
your wife does.
Well, she did at one point. I mean, I think isn't it more simple humor?
Fair enough. I like it. I still like him. I haven't watched him in a while, but like he was a big one for me. But yes, before, of course, as is customary as well of meme reviews, our host, you got to pick a rating system. What's your rating system for the memes? Okay,
so in honor of this show, it will be Hellenisms.
Okay. Okay. So how many Hellenisms then is your ratings?
Well, 1 to 10, maybe.
Okay, so 1 to 10 Okay, sure. 1 to 10 Hellenisms. Let's do it.
What would you want?
I mean, it's a bit, because like Hellenism is like an abstract concept.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, so I'm going to give this 5 abstract concepts. I mean,
no. It's like the memes. Like, goal is to in some way participate in like ontological funness or some type out there in the ether. So I think using abstract
Roman Extradio. All right, first meme. Ukrainian control versus Russian control versus Jeb control. I love the Jeb. The Jeb memes, I never get over them. They're they're top stuff. How do you rate this one?
Three Hellenisms. It's
ouch.
because it's very dated. That meme concept like needed to die in 2016 when Trump won.
Bruh.
Secondly, it gets 3 Hellenisms rather than 0 because it plays on the concept of like, how is it that I as a Dane understand like a reference to the primary election in America? I mean, that I think that's a good parallel to Hellenism. So
that's a crap rating. Like the Jeb meme never gets old because it's just it's one of those surprise memes that just comes out of nowhere. Like I just randomly saw this is in my Discord. A lot of the memes today, by the way, sourced by my Discord. I'm trying to make sure that that's like I'm going to be making sure from now on that that's like the primary source of memes for meme reviews from my Discord. So do pump your best memes in the Discord chat, in the Memetica chat if you want them to appear on this show, assuming they're not too hey, how you going? But this meme, I love this meme so much, even though it is old, because it just comes up out of nowhere and it's just absurd and hilarious. So
you sound a bit like Jeb Bush in that video where he said like, "Please clap."
Please clap. All right. Well, I give this one a solid like eight Hellenisms versus your 3. All right. Next one. Average modern sources fan. Can't say for certain. We don't have any reliable sources on this. We need to do more research versus the average ancient sources enjoyer. Could be 1, could be 3 million. I wrote a poem about it. I wasn't there, but my brother knows a guy who has a sister whose husband was there.
Yeah, definitely better. 7 Hellenisms.
7 Hellenisms. It's the best memes are the ones that just reflect reality because it's straight up true. You got your modern like source critics, for example, when they talk about like all the scriptures or even just any other ancient source, even outside of the scriptures, and they'll just like, oh well, this author is unreliable, and this definitely didn't happen because this would have been the case, and in my paradigm, this would have happened, so the author can't be right. And then there's the Chad ancient historian who's just like, I'm going to trust my sources.
I think we should just end the stream by concluding that Christ spoke Greek because trust me, bro.
Yeah, that's it. Because source, trust me, bro. 100% true. So you gave this 7 Hellenisms. Very nice rating. All right, next one. The villain kind of has a point. Everyone else watching the World War II documentary.
I'm not sure I have the confidence to comment on that meme. Oh.
Fair enough. Next meme. The Gospel of John has been used to justify anti-Semitism, so we should stop reading on Good Friday. Alrighty, boys. Gospel of John time.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's great. That's really good. Oh, the last one was also really funny. It's really good.
Yes.
But I think both of those memes would get 8 then, because better than the former, more my kind of dark, edgy humor. So that's nice. That's really good. And my wife and I, we read the Gospel of John together last evening, actually. So that one goes home.
Fair enough. Very fun. This meme is top. You've seen. I posted this this Gospel of John meme on my Twitter. It's just blown up. Absolutely blown up. A lot of people like it, retweet it, all that jazz. I didn't even make the meme, but I was just an early taker and I posted it up on the Twitter. Such a good one because it's so true. So true. I'm not going to be dictated by Jesuits on what I do to celebrate my Lord. Like, stuff off. Like, you're a Catholic, so shut up. But also you're a Jesuit, so double shut up. You literally persecuted our ancestors, our Protestant ancestors, so triple shut up. Oh man. But yeah. Anyway, next meme. We've got you surrounded. Come out and stop selling indulgences. I am the Antichrist. I am the Antichrist.
Yeah. Against fools, even the gods fight in vain. Do you have that proverb in English?
Say that again?
Against the fools, even the gods fight in vain.
Not in English, but that's a cool proverb.
Yeah, so I think it is like a supernatural wonder that we managed to convert that much of Europe. So
Based. Very, very based indeed. So how do you rate this one?
I think 6 Hellenisms because the editing is kind of lazy. I mean, they should have blurred out the lines and so on.
Yeah, I personally find many people find, but I in particular find that certain lazy editing means when done right, it just adds to the
Yeah.
quality of it.
Sometimes it is possible for it to add to.
But this is just pasted images.
Yeah.
Fair enough. All right, next one. True crime YouTubers talking about a real life murder versus lost media YouTubers talking about a cancelled episode of SpongeBob. Do you get this one much, or?
Yeah, I'm not sure. No.
I'm hoping more of the audience does, because it's so flipping true and hilarious. But so there's a whole like YouTube genre of well, just an internet genre generally of lost media. So like episodes from TV shows, even whole movies, or like found footage and all that, where it's known to exist, and maybe there's even little clips, but otherwise it's lost, and there's like an entire like mystery just to find the thing, and there's always lore and story and background behind it. And you can find a lot of like YouTube mini documentaries, channels, and all that talk about these lost media. And very often, even if it's just something like like this is literally true, even if it's just something as simple as a lost SpongeBob episode, they can make it like a really uneasy, creepy air to it, as if it's like, oh, scary mystery and all that. So this one hits me. This one hits me.
I'm actually really saddened when, for example, I read through Josephus' church history recently. And I mean, it's just so depressing to read about like all the tomes and books he quotes and references, and they're like 80% of it is just gone now. That's
what I would give to have all 5 volumes of Papias's expositions of the sayings of the Lord and the memoirs of Hegesippus. What I would give to have those today, because I've read somewhere, I forgot where, that Papias's work was extant even up to the 15th century. I've heard that. I've read that from somewhere. I forgot where. So I want to find it again. There's particularly this. I think it's this Oxford series of classical texts that it's like the latest edition of all the fragments of Papias with commentary, translation, and all that stuff. So I want to get that. It's pretty thick. It's pretty awesome. And I think maybe that comments in it. But what I would give that, God willing, that there is, I mean, who knows how many just like straight up heretical, like distorted traditions that Papias may record. Who knows? But just the fact that this is like the earliest 2nd century, and it's like 5 freaking volumes of living tradition from the Lord and the apostles. If that's just like laying down in some monastery somewhere, I hope we find it. That'd be legendary. Same with Hegesippus. But yes, anyway, next one. Hey guys, I just made a discovery watching SpongeBob. If you slow down the SpongeBob opening when the sponge is spinning, you'll see that he turns into a watcher angel / cherubim / Nephilim. What could this mean? Please discuss / post more angelic SpongeBob cartoon references.
That one is quite good. I think sometimes when entering the polemics of online Christianity, it's it's really easy to find arguments such as these, like, oh, if you like at the winter solstice stand like under my oak tree and close an eye and read the book a book upside down while murmuring some obscure old prayer, then it will, all these doctrines will make sense. I mean, it's kind of like that meme format with that crazy guy with all the dotted lines connecting the different pieces of evidence.
That's fair enough. So how many Hellenisms do you rate this one?
5.
5 Hellenisms. Far out. Tough critic indeed.
Yeah.
Next one. Fans of biblically accurate angels when you show them biblically accurate laws against sodomy, gluttony, misery, and fornication.
That's up there. That's 8 Hellenisms at least. That's funny.
Nice.
I think if humor is too toothless, then some of it's not. I don't find it as funny as some of the more spicy stuff.
Yeah, that's it.
Also because, I mean, I think this is a cultural thing, but Danish humor is generally like very dark and very much like Monty Python-ish, because it's really we don't joke lightly. We really make like sick jokes.
I'd love to see that challenge one day. Either I come down to you or you come down to me, and we'll exchange the common jokes around our circles,
Right.
and then get scandalized while we're at it.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
How many Hellenisms you are at this one?
8.
Nice, very nice and solid. All right. Wait, we're only venerating the calf, not worshipping it.
Yeah, dude, Moses, I really so dumb that we think that the calf is uncreated divinity itself. We're not offering any blood sacrifices to it. Come on, give us a go.
Moses, didn't you know that God himself created matter? So matter has itself been sanctified. Moses, what are you, a Gnostic?
And Moses, we also have some hyperdulia for you, so don't worry.
I mean, that's actually a really freaking good point. Moses, the only one in the entire Old Testament, and if we grant that this applies to, if we grant Catholic theology about Mary, sure, this eventually happened to her as well. But he's the first one ever to see God himself face to face. The only one to see God. So why on earth don't they give him hyperdulia? I mean, come on.
Anti-Semitism, that's why.
Yeah, they hate Catholics hate the Jews, confirmed. Oh man, solid meme, absolutely solid meme. And I think second to last or last. Nah, you're telling me you're just going to forgive me after all I've done? Yes.
Well, that's 10 for you.
Straight 10. I knew it. That's why I put it last. Just a nice wholesome fact meme, just to cap off the meme review, because it's straight up true. And that's the beauty. And that's why faith alone. Oops, sorry.
Yeah, that's also the whole point of my channel. I mean, what I want to do is, like, all this information, all this stuff that I'm trying to get out there, it's directed towards something. It's aimed for something, namely to move us unto godliness. I mean, it doesn't really matter whether Greek or Aramaic was spoken by our Lord. If you're not going to read the words of our Lord, if you're not going to use it to anything, then then just don't care about it. Because what I'm trying to get out there is that reading the very sweet words of Christ himself given to us in the original utterances, that should move us further unto godliness. That's the goal of it. That's what all this is about.
Big amen to that. Very true, very beautiful. And I think the whole thing, when you really stop and think, and frankly, I think because of this, it's not a coincidence that when you hear of like Roman Catholic conversion stories, for example, even Eastern Orthodox ones, I'll put them in as well, you almost never ever hear because of the gospel, that's why I converted. Virtually never ever hear that, ever. And frankly, it's not a coincidence, I don't think, because when you take this sentiment seriously about Jesus forgiving us after all I had done and all that, that itself on its own just naturally tends to the fact that we can't do anything to merit ourselves before God. We can't do that. Even that whole thing of, oh, well, it was initially unmerited, but now after initial justification, you can get even more justification by doing good works. And then, oh, well, you do a mortal sin, now you're totally unjustified. But it's okay. If you do these other works, you become justified again. And squaring that with the words of Paul and Jesus in a reasonable interpretation, impossible. Sorry, straight up impossible. Can't do it. But that's the beauty. That's the beauty of the gospel message. That's why whenever you hear people, in contrast, for example, converting to, I'd argue most commonly like a Reformed tradition, but just even generally Protestant traditions, you'll hear the gospel. You'll hear the gospel a lot, that they come to realize the sacramental treadmill is not what God wanted. It's not what Jesus instituted. It is very simple. It is a very simple recognition of the fact that I can't merit anything alone, and yet he will show me mercy anyway. And that obviously, in light of that, I'm going to do good, but it's not because he's expecting me as my individual in and of myself to do good after coming to faith, quote unquote, but because he is literally going to work in me. He is going to move me directly to do good. because of his spirit indwelling in me, which comes through the conduit of faith. That's the beauty of the real gospel message.
Yeah, I think that's a great. I mean, that's a great bridge to my next video.
That's it.
So, yeah.
That's it. That's your work right now. And I reckon to cap off this stream, we give you one final plug. I can even share the window right now to your channel so people know exactly what to look for right here. So give us. Oh, hang on. Got a little.
Yeah, nice.
What's up in your stream? There we go.
Yeah, it will just be a short plug. So I think that we are a lot of confessional Lutherans on YouTube. There's John Cooper, Brian Wolfmuller, and a few others. But I really think that
not a big presence though.
No, right? Yeah, not a big presence, and I mean it's only an American presence. So if people dare to cross the language barrier, then I think that the Lutheran tradition is so rich. We have so many great theologians, so much wonderful material, and our more traditional dealings with church history, the way that the Lutherans synthesize the patristic tradition, the way we refute the ridiculous claims of Rome. I mean, that is sorely lacking in our day and age. So I think that I hope you'll go and subscribe to the channel, because I really think that the content, the focus on the gospel, on the cross, on the work of Christ, and have some material refuting the very ahistoric claims of the Roman Church is something which is really lacking in our time. So,
yeah. Well, personally, I'd say it's coming up into almost the opposite way. We're getting a lot of people in the Protestant apologetics world, but A, not as much as there should be. B, not all of it's of top tier quality, and C, Roman apologetics is really, really ramping up. Even in, I don't know if you've noticed, but even in the past few weeks and months, like they've ramped up a lot of the content, like particularly on the issues of the monepiscopacy and Petrine offers, like video after video on Catholic answers, on reason and theology, on all the various channels from these popular Romanist apologists. They're ramping out stuff a lot. So there is a big need for solid Protestant responses.
I think that's also has to do with the fact that they're feeling the heat. I mean,
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
Protestants have historically been very awful, very bad at appreciating and using church history and the fathers. I think that apart from Anglicans and Lutherans and some of the more classic Reformed tradition, continental Reformed tradition, that is, then we have done a very, very bad ground game. So we really need to ramp it up. And already 100%. Now with that very small effort, then they need to be pumping out a lot of content to refute those very clear arguments.
That's it. That's why we exist. That's why we're both here. We're doing our thing with our channels. Like my stuff, I want it to be general, but it's no secret. A lot of it is dedicated to critiquing frankly, just the straight up errors of Rome, so that Christians don't end up falling for that. And so I think the best thing we can do and this is way off topic from the stream, but it's already over, so whatever. But the best thing we Protestants can do is make really strategic content, know where the weak point is, exploit it, make a definitive snap against it, which to plug again, by the way, that's exactly what I'm doing with 2 parts, upcoming streams. Only the first one's scheduled right now because then I want to find an ideal date for the second one. But 2-part streams, definitive, hyper in-depth investigation of all the primary source evidence on first, whether there was a monepiscopacy in Rome, whether there always was a single bishop over the Church of Rome, particularly in the Romanist concept of a single bishop. That's going to be a key thing to distinguish, because the idea of having a head bishop and then having a monarchical bishop in the Roman sense, so that it justifies, so that it actually grounds the papacy according to their own categories, these are not actually the same thing. So stay tuned for that first part of that stream. And then the second part is going to be investigating whether Christ actually established a quote-unquote Petrine office, and then whether this office was something that could actually be passed down to future people, with the fullness of its powers, the implications of that, whether that's true. I think you can probably tell where my conclusion is right now. Not that I'm putting the cart before the horse, not that I'm deciding my conclusion, because this is something. It's frankly the culmination of many years of on and off study on this issue, but with one final bout of very in-depth study. So that's going to be very good as well. And I intend to make a splash with these videos, with these streams rather, in the online apologetics world, because I am claiming to make definitive answers on these topics. So God willing, it makes a splash. God willing, it shows many people. Because I have received, actually, fun fact, I actually have received a few messages, not a huge amount, but a few messages from people who would say that my content was actually a factor in them not going over to Rome. So praise God for that, 100%. So God willing, these streams will be that for many more people, and possibly even better, showing existing Romanists the errors of their ways and bringing them out into a Christian tradition that has a proper understanding of the gospel. God willing, God willing. So that's my plug in the middle of your plug. To finish off with you, Michael, subscribe to his channel. Do it right now. He's got some amazing stuff. His first video is fantastic, bar the technical errors, which he is solving, and I believe he is doing with his latest one as well. And you're going to see a lot of fantastic content there. And we're going to be collabing definitely in the future. Well, of course, we've got our second part interview coming up a few days or a week or so from now. I'm not sure, maybe a bit over, on the Septuagint, where this Protestant will be arguing for the primacy of the Septuagint for our understanding of the Old Testament. And God willing, many more collaborations after that on both of our channels. That'll be excellent. Michael,
Great.
do you have any final words?
Well, only thank you for inviting me on the channel. I think it's an important and very interesting topic we discussed today. I hope to have shared some good data supporting my thesis, and that people will have some possibility to engage with that. It's an important question, and hopefully one we have cast some light on today.
100%. Thank you very much for coming on, Michael. This is awesome. I love that collab. And thank you, everybody who has watched and will be watching after this, particularly for Americans who are probably definitely still asleep right now, given the EST time. And thank you all. I hope you've all learned a lot from this video. I hope you got red-pilled on the language of Judea at the time of Christ, and considered that perhaps in this very book right here, the very Greek words in this book right here are the very words of Christ himself. That is something incredible to consider, because like I'm genuinely, bar some future some follow-up study on the primary sources myself, I am fairly convinced of this thesis myself, both from what Michael said here, what we've said in private, and all that jazz. And so it's amazing. We actually could have the words of Christ, the literal untranslated words of Christ right here. That's an amazing thought. So Michael, thank you so much for coming along. Thank you, everybody, for watching this. I hope you have a lovely day or evening. God bless.